course, as always, I am your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, the first member of the JK crew, Jackson Keller.
Hang on, I need to figure out how to fucking return to that. I think I just did. This week, we're talking about Kongs. We're talking about them donkeys and kings. We're not talking about Donkey Kong unless Jackson finds a way to tie Donkey Kong in, which, having our pre-discussion, he might. We'll see what happens.
I'm planning on tying Donkey Kong into this shit.
We are double featuring two King Kong movies, but not two King Kong movies. We're double featuring King Kong 1933 and skipping over Jackson Keller's King Kong, Peter Jackson's King Kong, and jumping straight for Kong Skull Island as admittedly a build-up to Godzilla vs. Kong coming out next week, because we hadn't watched Kong Skull Island, and as I said in our Godzilla War of Monsters, King of Monsters, whatever the fuck that movie is called, review critique, the most interesting thing about that movie was the ending, where they're talking about like finding out Hollow Earth and all the weird stuff that they discovered in the end credits, and it turns out that stuff was all established in Kong Skull Island. So here we are, Kong Skull Island.
Kong Skull Island. I guess I need to begin this episode with an apology to Sean, because basically I wanted an excuse to watch the Godzilla vs. King Kong from the 60s because it seemed like good memes. Frankly, I wasn't that terribly interested in Godzilla vs. Kong because infamously I did not care for that last Godzilla movie, but it seemed like a good idea for a conversation, and it would be relevant. So, hey, all right, you're going to propose that. And then it's like, well, what are we going to do? Like, it's not like we can do it like in the old days of the Horse Cast where we're, talking about stuff that's current every week. So we got to, fill the schedule. We can't always do obscure Japanese horror and anime horror. So I was like, well, okay. I've been curious to watch the original stop motion King Kong for a while, and that would be a good lead-in up to, Godzilla vs. King Kong in the week before. Now, the reason that this is an apology is that I did not adequately prepare Sean for what the original King Kong was like, because I had passing familiarity with it, although I had not seen it.
I thought King Kong was about people go to uninhabited island and find big monkey and hijinks ensue.
It's almost in pop culture, it's that. But I had more familiarity with King Kong as a franchise, like not just because I've watched like a couple of videos about it, like even back in the day, I think when I was still watching like the Angry Video Game Nerd, like he would talk about old like monster movies, and I'm pretty sure he did a video on that one that I watched. But not only that, but I had seen the Peter Jackson version, the 2005 version, and grown up quite liking it. So obviously I had more familiarity with, the Kong franchise, as it were. This is all to say that I knew King Kong was a horrifically racist film and mostly wanted to watch it from like a scholarly historical perspective. A miscalculation that I didn't explain to Sean before getting him to agree to it when he thought he was watching a monkey movie. So, Sean, I am terribly sorry.
King Kong 1933 is up there as one of the most reprehensible movies that we have watched on this podcast, if not the most reprehensible movie that we have watched on this podcast. And I would have appreciated some warning about that.
To be fair, like I knew that the movie was racist, but I wasn't sure to the extent that the movie was thematically racist, because there's two levels with King Kong, and also horribly misogynistic to boot. These things are intertwined, as it turns out. I knew that there would be some horrifically offensive like racial stereotypes in the movie, because I knew that
Could have warned me about that at least.
See, I
Like,
that was enough of the I thought that was like commonplace knowledge of King Kong enough that like it wouldn't have occurred to me to do that, because even in the Peter Jackson version there are natives and they are bad.
You forget that, one, I'm an idiot. Two, I know absolutely nothing. And three, most of my knowledge of King Kong comes from Robot Chicken. So Robot Chicken tends to gloss over that part.
I mean, understandably so. But yeah, so like I knew that was part of it. And I don't think even on Quarantine Classics that like even when it comes to the like stereotyping and caricature, I want to say King Kong's probably the worst one that we've done on that front. I can't think of any older movies that we've done. Maybe there's some, I mean, maybe like Postal comes close in different ways, but not in terms of like, you know, not like Gone with the Wind. Like, you know, this is up there with like Gone with the Wind, if not worse.
Postal, the thing about Postal is that Postal approaches it from such a nonsense shock value to it that it almost loses that reprehensibility. Like, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I am not forgiving Postal for being Postal, but like, it is so on its sleeve shitty and awful that it feels less shitty and awful because King Kong is so insidiously and quietly shitty and awful in a lot of ways, because that's what Jackson was getting at, is that there is overt racism to it, but there's also definitely a thread underneath it that is horrible.
And I think that the reason that I wanted to bring this up and talk about King Kong in the first place is that, so King Kong, I mean, people still, this isn't like Birth of a Nation where like, you know, it'll come up in textbooks as like, oh, this was a movie where like that defined a lot of like cinematic techniques, but also was a horrifically racist film about like, you know, KKK members as the heroes. Like King Kong is still considered like a unassailable classic in a lot of circles. So I think that, you know, one, even I underestimated, like, aware that, like, okay, there was probably going to be, you know, to put it lightly, some cringy racial stereotyping. But even I underestimated the extent of the thematic ugliness at the heart of the film. But I think what maybe like made me want to watch it and discuss it, and I think what only ended up reaffirming that point, was how much of that ugliness is still prevalent in, you know, American culture today, and how King Kong's DNA as a movie, as like a landmark piece of special effects film, as something that, you know, went on to be very inspirational to it's just something that still has an active franchise. Like, we're getting a new King Kong movie this year.
Next week, literally.
Yeah.
Not even this year. Next week.
So with a movie like this, I felt like it was, you know, like, not that I would recommend, you know, like, I mean, let's get this out of the way. Am I going to recommend that your average person goes and watches King Kong like 33? Heavens no. Heavens no.
I would go so far as to say that we're going to freely discuss King Kong 1933 here without a spoiler tag. We'll put a spoiler tag before we talk about some of Skull Island, because that's a movie that I could recommend. I know Jackson wasn't as favorable on it, but like, it's still recommendable if you're looking for the right person about it. I have no issue saying don't watch King Kong 1933. If you're looking for some like landmark filmmaking as far as monster movies go, just watch fucking Godzilla. I know it came out 20 years later. That's fine though. Fuck King Kong.
Well, I have a my caveat. It's very similar to my caveat for what was it called? Little Shop, which was also similarly troubling, except this is 1,000 times more so. I mean, honestly, if watch a YouTube video of the fight between King Kong and the Tyrannosaurus to get your like stop motion special effects fixins. And you can safely ignore the rest.
So, in other words, no spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers. That said, I do think that like if you are like a scholar or a creative person, even, I think that it can be. I don't want to say like helpful, but almost responsible. Like if you approach King Kong with this lens and like really do your damnedest to engage with like a lot of the troubling implications that this still has on cinema and culture today, it's a very sobering experience, a very depressing one. So I think that as like for you know if you fancy yourself like a filmmaker, I don't think it would hurt to be reminded just how many, I mean, like Birth of a Nation, how many cinematic techniques were used for the explicit purpose of like white supremacy and colonialism, and how these things are not so easily disentangled. Because this is something that I was thinking about. Right now, from where I'm recording, I'm staring at my Nintendo Switch case, which has, I have a little sticker of Yoshi on it, and Yoshi is of course my favorite game character, just my favorite thing, probably. Infamously so. Not so much on this show, but on other platforms, I tend to get mocked relentlessly for being such a weirdo like Yoshi stan. But
sure, wait, do I not mock you enough?
You mock me enough for plenty of other things.
Okay.
Plenty of other things that are more relevant to my behavior on this particular show.
I was gonna say, I try not to mock people for like things that they like and favorites and stuff like that. Like at least playfully in some regard. But like if I need to be mocking you more for your love of Yoshi, you're dumb. How I got nothing, man. I got nothing in the tank. King Kong has drained me entirely.
That's fine. I mean, this is basically the only thing I really want to say about King Kong 33. So like we can move on pretty quickly once I finish this point. But it was honestly pretty sobering to like look at Yoshi, and like I just had this brain blast of this idea that, oh, where did Yoshi like come from? Well, he's a character in the Super Mario Brothers franchise. Where did the Super Mario Brothers franchise come from? Well, that started with Donkey Kong and the arcades, a game that shaped an entire industry. Where did Donkey Kong come from? It came from fucking King Kong. So like even, in something as innocuous as like a green Barney, the degrees of separation from the history of like white supremacy and fucking genocide are not at all far removed. And I'd wager that most pop culture products are similarly closely related to something that is so morally horrific. And we don't, I mean, I don't know if you want to even bother explaining in detail like what is so horrific about it in terms of themes, or if we just want to give the short version, because Sean and I had two slightly different readings of it. Both of them are horrifically racist and not good.
Hey, editor Sean here. Originally when Jackson asked this question, I kind of hemmed and hawed and eventually gave kind of a non-answer about the whole thing, mostly because the idea of racism is deeply uncomfortable to me, especially as a white person. So I felt very weird and out of my depth trying to prescribe what I viewed as a very racist reading of this movie to this film, mostly because I was concerned that I would be misrepresenting it in some capacity. After hearing what Jackson's about to say coming up here, I kind of want to take that back, and I'm going to deliver what my reading of the movie was, which is to say that it is a movie that is advocating pretty much for the re-enslavement of black people across America, or if nothing else, the killing of black people across America. And this is something that the movie seems to really say in its visual language, and I will do my best to describe it in shorthand, just to keep things quick and moving along. Basically, the idea of the film is that white people go to a foreign land and capture in chains the biggest and strongest being of that land, and then bring it back to America. The easy answer would be to say monkey. However, this movie so intrinsically links monkeys to black folks in a way that is horrendously racist, and you don't need me to tell you that. So I don't necessarily want to just call it a monkey at this case, because that feels derogatory in and of itself, because it is. However, when they bring this monkey, this being, back to America in chains, when it eventually does break out, it turns into this whole white panic thing of, oh, this being, this monkey is going to take our white women, our golden women, as the movie presents it, and just basically terrorize the quote-unquote white way of life. And the only way it can be stopped is by killing it. And reading it as white people went to another country, brought people back from that country to America. We then unchained these people through emancipation. And then from there, the movie basically says, in doing so, given the monkey is a black stand-in, damaged our white way of life, and the only way to undo this is to kill, and that the freeing of slaves was a mistake. Jackson gets into a little bit more of the nuance, where it could also be read as the mixing of races in general was a mistake, but I'll let him talk about that right now.
Well, I mean, we can tie up this little point. I'll finish my point here about King Kong 33, and then we can move on. We don't have to have a big, long discussion about it, but I do think these things are worth mentioning if we are, in the business of sort of confronting the horrors of our culture. I do think that the other, maybe the scarier thing, as opposed to like, so, it's like, Donkey Kong's based on King Kong. King Kong is, a thematically, like, vile movie. Does that really, like, that's good to know, and that's, like, good to keep in context and, like, think about where and the systems in the world that, like, produce the things you enjoy. Like, that's part of being, like, a responsible, like, media literate person. But at the end of the day, like, it's not like that makes playing Donkey Kong Country some, like, big crime, But I think what's more important to note here is that with Sean's reading the movie, mine's a little different in that I think that King Kong is nominally anti-imperialist, but in that very 19th century white man's burden, still very racist way. And the reason that I think that is that, like, infamously, and, like, speaking of Godzilla, which is based, that one of the inspirations for Godzilla was King Kong, and this element of, like, sympathy for the monster, which I do think is there to some degree, but it's there in a very, like, the movie is not at all subtle about its racial coding, and it seems to me that basically the argument between that and sort of the scummy behavior of the director who kind of gets everything started in terms of the plot, like ends up bringing Kong back, is that what the director did was bad. The director doing a colonialism was bad, and King Kong is a victim, but this is just what happens when people don't keep to their own kind, is seemingly what the movie is saying, which is extra depressing about King Kong, is that if you do take that reading that I have, is that, like, there's an impulse I think a lot of people have when looking at old stuff to just sort of wipe away and, like, dismiss things, like, oh, like, that's just how it always was in these old stories, like, we can dismiss it out of hand. But the really sad thing about King Kong is that, like, basically, in a word, what King Kong is arguing for, if you take my reading, is an ethno-state, which is something that is very much coming back in vogue thanks to the current Republican Party and the people who support it. Donald Trump didn't just go away, and he didn't come out of nowhere. And, like, I remember that, like, I think the thing that really shook me was, like, when I was doing a little bit of, like, light reading on the different versions. I rewatched, like, the Lindsay Ellis overview on the different versions, read up on the Peter Jackson version reminded myself of a few things. That the one thing that I saw was that like someone was saying that like, oh, you know, my favorite King Kong movie is still the original because the stop motion is great and it's got good action, and like I put my kids in front of it and they were not bored. So like I think that's why even though it's depressing, it's important to point this stuff out, because not only is like King Kong as a franchise still going that's so deeply rooted in colonialism and white supremacy, the original is like, still being watched. And for a lot of people, it is just a silly movie about a giant monkey and these like stereotypes and this coding and this thematic ugliness isn't going to be picked up on them except maybe subconsciously, which is why I at least thought it was important to have this conversation. But the ugly business is out of the way. We can talk about Skull Island.
Yeah, let's try and climb out of the dregs of King Kong 1933. And I mean, it's going to be a tricky one to kind of change perspectives on this, just because what Jackson was saying is entirely true and very much a conversation that's important to have. And I mean, even skipping over my own reading of the movie, which I'm doing mostly because I just don't want to talk about this movie, not from a we shouldn't talk about this movie, much more from just I got done with it and thought, wow, this was reprehensible, and I'm just not interested in discussing it from my own perspective on the podcast. There's a bit of a challenge to kind of taking that and going, okay, well, let's now talk about the blockbuster of 2017 that is Kong Skull Island, which is a very different vibe across the board, and admittedly very intentionally so. It's a movie that is very, very aware of the issues of King Kong 1933 and sets out to reconcile with them in a way that is admittedly a little ham-fisted, but honestly, and this might just be some form of Stockholm Syndrome following up on the horror that was King Kong 1933, I still found myself really enjoying it. It is not a good movie. I have no issue with saying that. But it is a movie that is one that I would heartily recommend to people who are just looking for a casual, fun time to watch a movie. The characters are broad. The themes are written in the fucking sky by helicopters. And I don't know what more I could say about it other than it was still pretty fun, honestly, despite all that. It had some style to it. It had some panache. It had some just, oh my God, they got that guy in this movie. And hey, I clapped, and I'm not ashamed to admit that once in a while, especially on a podcast in which we regularly dunk on blockbusters and instead opt for art house Japanese horror films. I am, at my heart, still an absolute sucker for trash, and I fucking like blockbusters. I'm not afraid to admit it. It's a bold stance, I know, but I'm willing to take it.
My man dying on that multi-million-dollar hill.
Jackson, tell me why you didn't like Skull Island.
So Skull Island, I mean, I don't want to, especially after, talking about the horrors of history, I don't want to, bring down the vibe too much. But honestly, a lot of what I felt about this movie was kind of Control-C, Control-V from my infamous, Godzilla King of Monsters PowerPoint global warming rant. It's not as concentrated in this movie, whereas that movie was, mostly trash and had one really annoying scene where the villain, looked at the camera and said the themes. But I don't know. I think that watching the movie made me kind of realize that I'm very burnt out on blockbusters and have been very thankful that we haven't really been watching them on the show for a while. The movie was fine. It wasn't bad. In terms of like an entertainment, it did have some style. It did have, enjoyable actors. But I guess I wasn't sure what to expect from Skull Island, and I couldn't help but compare it to the Peter Jackson version, which I also wish I rewatched, which, does not at all redeem the history of colonialism from the original King Kong, but does have kind of a weird proto Shape of Water relationship between a nice girl and her monkey pal that I really liked. And I think that maybe like, what would have had me really interested is that, we've been talking about Godzilla, and one of the reasons we're talking about King Kong is that we've been talking about Godzilla, and how like one of the things that got me so mad about Shin Godzilla was that it was taking something that was like ideologically based and making an entry that was ideologically vile. I was sort of interested. I was kind of hoping low key that Skull Island would be full the anti Shin Godzilla, that'd be the opposite of that. That'd be the taking something that is ideologically vile and making it based. Which I mean it kind of does, but
it's not that. It's just not subtle about it.
Yeah, it's not that. But I don't know. Like when I just tend to feel more like annoyed and bored when I'm hearing what I feel like are kind of preachy one-liners from thin characters, and at that point, like even with a blockbuster, I guess, like, maybe you can say that I'm a snob, but like I think that there's still a way
I can and will.
That's fair, but I think that like in my favorite blockbusters, usually there's, even if it's a simple theme, there's like an attention to that theme that like, makes it really engaging emotionally. And I think that like that this it's just, I mean, Kong Skull Island, although it wasn't a bad movie, it just had a lot of trappings of modern blockbusters that I'm just burnt out on and don't really care for. At my meanest, I would call it like Marvel's King Kong. I don't know. I just didn't get that much out of it.
I think that's somewhat fair. I do think that there is a bit more to it. I think that you're kind of colored by your view of Jackson Keller's King Kong.
No, that's probably fair.
Yeah, I do think, like, I obviously don't know because I have never seen Jackson Keller's King Kong.
And for the record, I didn't rewatch it either, so it might actually be bad. I did see it when I was a kid, but it did leave a strong impression. So
that's what I was gonna say. Is like, obviously you haven't seen it in a long time either, and so part of that could just be you hyping it up in your head, but it could also be, hey, wow, that was actually great, and Sean's a jackass who's accusing you of having rose-tinted glasses for this movie that actually fucking rips. And if that's the case, I do deeply apologize, but I mean, I think that there is just intrinsically, and this is not a dig against you, this is for literally everyone, an urge to compare things that we know to things that are new. And so there's an urge to compare your memories of Jackson Keller's King Kong to Kong Skull Island, which I seem like they're doing two different things.
They are, yeah.
There's a ice skating scene of the monkey in New York with the lead in Jackson's King Kong, and I can't imagine that at all in Skull Island. So yeah, I don't know. I think that, I mean, even the thematic elements of Skull Island, as I said, and as you said, are very ham-fisted and on their sleeve, and just like turn to the camera. Did you know that the Vietnam War was bad? To which everyone nods, yes, we did. I mean, I think that the reason why I can forgive that so much is, one, it's right. And I have a far higher tolerance for movies that have a thematically accurate idea behind it. Two, it is actually a theme, so that's a step above Marvel's King Kong. And it's not just, oh, look, superheroes punch things and this guy is bad and this person is good. It's actively like exploring those ideas. Three, it's in direct conversation with the original King Kong and seeking to undo a lot of the ideology that makes the original King Kong so utterly reprehensible. And four, it is flash in the pan, turn to the camera. Did you know that the Vietnam War was bad, and not, here's a 6-point presentation on why these monsters are here as a direct result of global warming and why this is the thing. And especially because in the movie, that was presented as a villainous plan. Like, that's saying, hey, the villains believe in global warming, which is an issue we've talked about on this podcast before. It's a weird sort of...
yeah. Keeps coming up.
Moral thing going on in film right now that is strange and a lot to unpack and not something that we're going to do right now. Whereas this is, the villain thinks Vietnam was good and we should stay in it, and the heroes are like, no, we should leave. Vietnam was bad. So like there's not that moral complexity of, but what if the villain is actually saying something right that ends up not being actually moral complex and just stupid? So I think that there's more to this movie as a blockbuster than you're giving it credit for, just because, I mean, it is a blockbuster, but it's at least a blockbuster with something to say, and it's at least not, fascism is good.
I mean, I definitely preferred watching this to Shin Godzilla. That's for damn sure. I mean, I think that's fair, and I think that like your assessment of the differences between this and the scene in question that I compared it to in King of Monsters is apt in that like this is like a lot more straightforward, and it is correct in that regard. I guess just for me as a viewer, like that's still, maybe it's the teacher in me, but like, like when your teacher's like grading your math test and like you get the answer right, but you didn't show your work.
One time I got a chemistry answer right because I just wrote x equals 4 onto the paper, and it was correct. It was just a random guess. I didn't know how to do the problem, and my teacher was not pleased.
That's amazing. But yeah, well, I guess that's a good example. Like, I guess I kind of feel like when a movie, even if it's correct, when a movie is so like bald-faced about it, I guess I feel like that's sort of the thematic equivalent of writing x equals 4 at the bottom of the page. It's like with a movie, I want the movie to engage me emotionally and make me feel that x equals 4,
Here's an interesting thought exercise for you, though, and this is kind of how I was interpreting it, which is to say that the movie is only kind of surface level about Vietnam and how Vietnam was bad, and is far more about how colonialism is bad through the lens of Vietnam, because it basically takes the Vietnam War, which a vast majority of people now look at and say, hey, that was a stupid fucking thing we did, and also bad and also morally wrong, and applies it to King Kong in the same way. It basically is comparing King Kong and what happened in King Kong 1933 to the Vietnam War, and thus further expanding it to be like, hey, we should look at how we are treating things, and as much as colonialism and imperialism, and just using the Vietnam War as a shorthand to get people who are watching the film to engage with it on those ideas by saying, here's something that you already know is bad, now take it a step further and let's explore why that's bad in comparison to these two movies.
I think that's fair and probably the intention. I guess that's the other thing too, is that like I feel like with kind of the shorthand approach, let's say the sky writing, the Goodyear blimp approach to theme. With that, I feel like more so than inviting the average viewer to think about it more, I feel like the thought kind of stops there when it's so surface level, like even in a blockbuster like this, because no matter what, in a blockbuster like this, not everyone is gonna like know or care that it's like an allegory for Vietnam and that like it expands to colonialism, right? Like you're never gonna get everyone.
Everyone will know that it is an allegory for Vietnam. There is that is not skywriting. That is fucking tattooed on your eyeballs.
Man, I mean, like I think that like even in that case, like obviously it's inescapable that the setting is like Vietnam War era, but I don't know. I still think that a lot of people would probably watch this and just say, it's about a monkey during the Vietnam War. What are you talking about? Like
that's fair. I am extrapolating on the fact that it is borrowing heavily on Apocalypse Now as a visual stand-in, which I imagine not everyone is going to be as intimately familiar with. I mean, fuck, I haven't watched Apocalypse Now to out myself as a fake movie fan, but like I understand the visuals of it mostly because I like Kubrick and I like seeing movie visuals, and everyone knows the helicopters, Ride of the Valkyries, sunset shot. That's just a thing. But whereas I'm aware that it is in Apocalypse Now a movie about the Vietnam War and why it's bad, other people might just be like, oh, it's that one shot from that one movie without the context of what it means. So I see where you're coming from, but
yeah, and I guess that's just the thing, is that like I feel like I've developed. I mean, I said it out right here that I'm like, oh man, like I'm kind of exhausted by blockbusters. But like one of my favorite movies is the original Avengers, like still probably, or at least like that was a very like formative experience. And part of the reason for that was that I felt like even if the themes of that movie were, you know, brain dead simple of like teamwork is nice and we should all get along, like the reason that movie kind of set the template for like all, basically not just all of Marvel, but most blockbusters to follow for the past 10 years was that, like, you know, at its core, there was like a, you know, emotional like character dynamics and like, you know, the tension of like, oh, we're going to make like Banner pissed off. And I think that like more so than a theme being simple or being obvious, I think what I really take issue with, even in a blockbuster like this, is sort of the flatness of character. And I think that's where it tends to fall a little flat for me. I was actually a little disappointed because I was also delighted by how many good actors are in this movie.
John Goodman's in it. That's all you need to know from us.
John Goodman is in it, and he and like when I saw a lot of those actors, like as like it definitely caught my attention at first, but as the movie went on, I'm like, okay, they're not really given that much interesting stuff to do or development. Like John C. Reilly's characters has the most going on, and I do love me some John C. Reilly.
Put John C. Reilly with a katana in every movie.
That's true. I can't argue with that. It actually did take me a minute to recognize Tom Hiddleston because he was being like Nathan Drake, and I'm like, wait, what the fuck?
I did not recognize Tom Hiddleston at all because without the Loki hair, I just cannot recognize the man. That is just a fact of my life, especially as someone who is terrible at recognizing actors.
He's a very handsome man. I always forget that like he looks like a real person when he doesn't have the Loki hair. And he's not in the full, like, you know, Asgard robes and the horns and shit.
But I mean, I definitely see where you're coming from. As I said, I acknowledge that the characters are entirely broad. But again, I didn't necessarily find the characters in Kong 1933 particularly deep. Again, we can talk about the misogyny of King Kong 1933.
Let me be clear that any criticism I have of Skull Island is not an implicit endorsement of 33.
No, I'm well aware of that. I'm more using it as a reference point to, again,
right,
Stockholm Syndrome as to why I like Skull Island so much. Because I basically was like, oh, wow, this is 99.9% less racist. There's still some weird Asian mysticism going on in it, but it's smaller. It's still bad, and it's not excusable, but it's smaller. And I think that was all I needed to be like, it's not advocating for the death and or re-slaving of the black community. Oh. So, yeah, I think that's really where I'm at with it. And I also just thought it was interesting because I was kind of watching it and seeing where it went. Okay, this is what King Kong 1933 did, and this is how we're going to invert it to make it less horrendously racist, misogynist, sexist, fucking anti-human. Yeah.
No, that's fair. And I guess it's just a difference like of perspective. Because like when I think that the way that they sort of overcorrected into more racism with the natives is kind of the prime example of this, in that like, you know, that's kind of the surface level thing of like, all right, so the old native characters obviously were like, you know, the worst of the old like stereotypes about, you know, not white people. So like we're gonna overcorrect and we're going to like, you know, have them be like a perfect mystical society and like kind of yeet ourselves into another unfortunate hole.
It's the quote unquote positive stereotypes where I don't understand how it's a stereotype. It makes them look good.
Yeah.
Type of thing. Yeah, it definitely overcorrects.
Yeah. And I guess it's like maybe like I guess broadly like, you know, thinking about my feelings on the movie, like I again not that I'm not down to clown with like anti-colonialist King Kong. I am, but like I kind of want the anti-colonialist King Kong to be as effective and advocating its point as unfortunately Shin Godzilla is advocating for nationalism and fascism. And I think that, yeah, like having strong characters is part of that, like having that emotional connection, because, you know, I sort of like japed and like brushed it off the Shin Godzilla connection, but, you know, that movie seriously acclaimed, so clearly a lot of those pretty terrible ideas connected with people.
Yeah, I cannot find any fault in your logic of why you did not like Skull Island, but I think that it really just boils down to, it's more my speed in a lot of regards. I am at this point in my life far more receptive to blockbusters, mostly because we've been watching things that are more art housey or classics or Doom.
I guess you could argue Doom tries to be a blockbuster.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can make that argument, but the more point that I was making of it is that it was bad, and like any blockbusters we've watched of late have been intentionally bad. We're basically using them as cultural artifacts to explore what makes the storytelling bad, where it failed, what's changing about it. And this is the first one that, you know what? I've said this before, it's not good, but it is thoroughly enjoyable. And sometimes I just need something that I can eat popcorn with and go, haha, yeah, Vietnam was bad, right?
No, I mean, that's totally fair and that's totally valid, because I recognize that I am obsessive, shall we say, when it comes to media. I recognize that I am definitely in the minority on this stuff, that I definitely take all this shit way too seriously. I'll cop to that. And yeah, I mean, I think, but a part of it's also aesthetic too. Like, just thinking about it, like, if you asked me just like off of what I remember, you know, even, you know, let's chop the, you know, all the horrible scenes with the natives out of the Peter Jackson version. And it's like, well, Jackson, do you think with this movie, with this style, do you think Sean would like it? And I'd have to sit there and think about it. I mean, he'd probably get a kick out of like the ice skating scene and some of the weirdo stuff, but I think overall probably not. Like, some of it's just like a style vibe thing. And this movie, I mean, it was stylish, but it wasn't my style, I guess.
No, I am far more of the into the hyper, like, saturated neon stylings of the late 70s, 80s era stuff. Like, that shit's my absolute jam. So as the style goes, yeah, it's definitely more my thing. But hey, that's fucking showbiz, baby.
That's fucking showbiz. Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, like, it's been made pretty clear over and over again. But even in my, you know, schlock blockbusters, I do tend to appreciate that, you know, that little bit of like grounding. I am a child of the gritty realism Batman era, you know, assuredly.
Yeah, and I grew up, even with those around me, far more in the vibrant 80s nonsense, and that's why that tends to tickle me a little bit more. But at least Jackson and I can agree that most Marvel movies are okay at best.
That's our Predator arm meme, you know, like gritty realism, like, you know, Zack Snyder apologist, you know, 80s, you know, pop art like schlock, you know, dunking on Marvel movies in the center.
But that is also, for what it's worth, Wonder Woman 1984 was a giant letdown. As someone who likes 80s movies, as an aside, just to throw that in there, I have to dunk on something here.
Wonder Woman 1984. I mean, I actually thought I'd like it more than I thought I would, and then the rest of the movie happened. I was charmed by it for a little while, but then the rest.
You mean when it started out where superheroes actually saved people and
yeah,
did,
I was like, man,
things?
This is Christopher Reeve as fuck. This is great. And then Pedro Pascal was like Monkey's Paw Donald Trump for some reason.
Which, honest to God, I would have watched if it was just Pedro Pascal, Monkey's Paw, Donald Trump. I would have been fucking all about that movie. That was utter nonsense. Pedro Pascal is a goddamn treasure with how much hard he was acting in that.
He is a treasure. I love Pedro Pascal.
But no, the rest of that movie was an utter. There was just too much fucking happening in it. It was
The problem was that there were 10 plot lines that could have been good.
And that is the problem, is that they all could have been good. Every single one of them, except maybe Cheetah. They kind of did Cheetah dirty in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of 80s, 90s schlock, that was very much Jim Carrey, the Riddler, done again.
Yeah, it was bad. But the other stuff in there could have been interesting. This is not really relevant to anything. But I think we're just kind of padding runtime right now because we could talk about spoilers in Skull Island. But I mean, we've spent a lot of time kind of just debating the merits of it that I don't know that I really need to, beyond saying, again, it's in conversation with 1933 and does a lot to counteract that with some success, as we've already talked about. I mean, I don't feel a strong need to get into the specifics of it, so...
Sure. I guess the only thing I'd say that as far as the actual story, so because I'm very interested. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about King Kong at all, and Godzilla at all, is that I'm very interested in the cultural symbolism of monsters, and I think maybe the other on that front, the slight letdown of this movie. Not that I need my King Kong to kidnap a lady and climb a tower necessarily, but I do think that in a lot of ways, because it was so far removed from sort of the idea of King Kong, that it almost felt more like we were watching Godzilla, but a monkey. Does that make sense?
No, it does, honestly. And I was thinking about this a lot because I do think that much like the original Godzilla, there's a lot of anti-war theming to this movie as well.
Yeah.
I think that they very much leaned more into the Godzilla of it than the King Kong of it, which is something that I already mentioned a little bit, in that if you want to watch a classic monster movie, watch Godzilla, don't watch King Kong. And my thought would have honestly been to continue forward and say, if you want to watch a King Kong movie, watch Kong Skull Island, which does the antithesis of the original King Kong in a lot of ways, which the antithesis of the original King Kong is Godzilla. So
true.
And you won't hear any argument from me that I don't necessarily even say that the original Godzilla is strictly better than Kong Skull Island, just because they do very different things. They're from different eras. They're from different cultures altogether. I think that Kong Skull Island is very American in its over-the-topness, and I think Godzilla is very Japanese in its over-the-topness. And strictly saying that one is better than the other is kind of hard. I think Godzilla is the stronger classic, absolutely. But I mean, there's going to be times I'm just going to be more in the mood for fucking nonsense Skull Island than Godzilla. So I don't know. Basically, what it boils down to is don't watch King Kong 1933, watch Godzilla or Skull Island. You know which one you want to watch. They're both fine for what they are. One is good, one is not good but enjoyable.
Tell you what, gamers, because I am still curious, and the phantom pain that I have here, because it probably would have been more fun and more fruitful to do Peter Jackson versus Skull Island, because I think that'd be the more relevant comparison as a successor to something bad.
And I wouldn't be sad and miserable for the first 20 minutes of this podcast.
Yeah, which I am truly sorry about.
No, don't be.
But tell you what, gamers. I mean, I'm again, I'm not sure that movie would be Sean's jam anyway. Maybe you'll get a little side segment book report from me on maybe I'll go watch Peter Jackson's version on my own again, because I've been curious for a while, and maybe on a future episode I'll give you a little breakdown, because I guess if we're talking about the comparison of King Kong's more like Godzilla here, I think that the one thing that the Peter Jackson version does strongly that I remember is reframe the King Kong iconography in a way that humanizes them. In a way, I think that is a response to the horrible colonialist racism and stereotyping of the original, that we do actually have a real character who has a central relationship with another character, and isn't that nice? But who knows, maybe it's overlong and bad. I'll tell you all sometime.
I very much hope that you don't have like a cowboys and aliens situation on your hands or anything like that. I don't think it would be.
I might honestly, but like I think the difference is because how did you feel about Cowboys and Aliens when you first watched? Because I really loved King Kong as a kid, like the Peter Jackson version.
It's not as apt of a comparison, admittedly. Like I was kind of thinking more along the lines of The Mist might be a better comparison because The Mist is a movie that really stuck with me, but like I was trying to go a little bit more extreme in that you might not end up liking it, whereas I still have a big soft spot for The Mist, even though I know it's not a great movie.
No, I think that's totally possible. Like that's one of the reasons, because it's been, especially as time has gone on, it's been pretty divisive. Even back in the day, it was pretty divisive. But I remember, like, it wasn't just me. Me and my friends loved that movie. We thought it was the most badass shit. And, maybe it's just overindulgent Peter Jackson Hobbit schlock.
Tune in to find out. I got a question for you, Jackson.
Lay it on me.
Are we watching the 1960s Godzilla vs. Kong, or are we watching the new one? Because I think we might have had different interpretations of which one we're watching.
Oh, my interpretation was that we were going to watch both.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. Absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
I thought we were just watching the new one. I didn't realize that you wanted to watch both. Fuck it. Yeah, let's watch both. I'm fine with that.
I mean, the schlock Godzilla vs. Kong from the 60s was like, the juicy center of this like Tootsie Pop that I wanted to get to. The rest of this was, again, the new movie was an excuse. Like especially now that out of these Monster Universe movies, I've seen 2 out of the 3 and didn't care for 2 of them. So
That's fair. I still like Godzilla 2014, to be clear. I don't think that you would. Getting more and more into it, I don't think that you would. It is just as broad as some of this other stuff, but I think visually it's pretty fucking neat, and is a fairly fun ride through it. I haven't watched it since it came out, and since I gained some form of media literacy beyond haha big monster shoot blue laser. So I might go back and be like, oh no, this is also reprehensible. But I did like it when it came out, and I think it probably, if nothing else from a visual standpoint, it holds up pretty well. But we'll find out.
It definitely, like, I appreciate, from what I know about it, like, what always put me off was that movie came out around the time Breaking Bad came out. And I did want to see it, but just never got around to it. And like around the time Breaking Bad ended, rather. And, Bryan Cranston was in it. Everyone said that Bryan Cranston was great, but he was only in like the first 10 minutes of the movie, and that the movie would have been more interesting if it were about him. And when I heard there wasn't much Bryan Cranston, and that like the human characters weren't as interesting, I maybe lost a little bit of interest, because otherwise I do appreciate that like Jaws like slow reveal of mostly focusing on the human characters. Like I'm definitely down to clown with that. I mean, we both stan Alien around here, so
I would honestly agree with that on the whole. As I said, I kind of have a soft spot for it. I thought it was really fucking cool to watch in theaters, and I do think that Bryan Cranston was probably the most interesting part of it. But Ken Watanabe saying "let them fight" is fucking rad as hell. And there, there's just some good stuff. Like these movies, even though they are bad, and I'm talking all 3, 2014 King of Monsters and Skull Island, there are some parts in all of them that are fucking great in their own way. They're just like visually interesting, or like somebody has a great line or whatever. There's some good shit in all these movies, even if they're not the best.
I mean, yeah, even though, like I said, I'm kind of burnt out on like modern blockbusters, these are far from the worst modern blockbusters that I've watched. Like these are not worse than at least the fucking Whedon cut of Justice League or Batman versus Superman, right? Like,
yeah, I would take this over Man of Steel any day.
Oh my god, Man of Steel. Man of Steel is like what happens. I think that was a very formative movie, because that was like, let's make a movie that seems like perfectly aimed at Jackson Keller, except let's make it horrible.
That's a movie that made me care about Superman, and I don't care about Superman. And I don't say that as a good thing. It made me defend Superman as a character, because that movie was an assassination attempt.
Amazing.
Oh, boy. All right. I've been your host, Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda.
And I've been Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller and Twitch at Jackson J. Keller. Come on, I'm going to be playing video games.
Follow the podcast at BADH_cast on Twitter. You can support us on Patreon. Well, you can't support us on Patreon. Patreon is currently paused, but theoretically, you can go check out our Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast. No idea what you can do with it while it's paused, but hey, if you want it, it's there. As always, thanks towards the highway for use of our theme song. It is Suicide, on their take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should go check them out. However you can support their music, stream their music, buy their music on Bandcamp, whatever you got to do. Also, thanks to 25 Years Later Site.com. There's a little button of us in the corner that you should absolutely go click on. But while you're over on that website, you should check out all the really talented writing from a lot of really talented authors. They're great. They're talented. My vernacular is shrinking by the second. Next week, we are apparently watching both Godzilla vs. Kong movies. This is news to me, but it is not upsetting news. Unless, Jackson, wait, hang on. Is there anything you need to tell me about this movie before we watch it?
I actually was just reminded, because I didn't know this part. I didn't know that there were any cringy racial stereotypes in Godzilla vs. Kong. I thought it was pure like rubber suit schlock, but apparently there is some good old fashioned Japanese racism in that one. Although I don't know how much. I'm not as familiar with this one, but the natives are there and they are not good. So that's my content warning.
Stellar. Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go